All right. No, we don't. We have a couple more minutes, but I want to explain to everyone sort of what's going on. It looks like as of this very moment, table number 4, which is increased visibility of library holdings in commercial search engines, will be the group that is doing the live stream, because 20% of the live stream respondents want to hear that. So table number 4 is suddenly being moved to the back. There's also been some question about vendor sniping. We thought that we thought not to recreate the panel and have everyone just, sniping at each other, because that probably wouldn't be very productive. Although maybe some might find it entertaining. I don't think that vendors would appreciate it, though. I guess the easiest way to do this is, who wrote that down? And what did you mean by writing it down? Yes.
You should have known it was going to be me.
So here, just so that people are clear about what you meant.
I have to use the microphone. Okay, what I meant is I'm getting tired of seeing vendors writing about how, look at the good stuff we're doing, and we want to do this too, but this vendor over here isn't playing very good with us. And this vendor says, we're trying to do this really good stuff, but this vendor over here says we're not playing well with them. We are playing well with them, but they want us to play the way they want, not the way we want to play. And this is becoming very counterproductive because they're spending so much time and energy taking shots at each other instead of playing well together. And I know we as librarians want them all to play well together, but they as business people also have to make sure they're making money. And as having worked for a vendor, heaven forbid your vendors go out of business one day, you pick up the phone, and you call them, and they say, sorry, that company is no longer in business. So I'm a little concerned. Is there something we can do so that we can have the vendors not taking shots at each other? And is that something maybe we shouldn't even be discussing in this venue? Maybe there's a better venue for it.
Well, there you have it. That's an explanation of what that was meant. So, in true democratic fashion, find a topic that interests you. So, one is standardizing vocabularies. That's over here. Vendor sniping would be here. Well, if there's anyone that wants to talk about it. Direct transfer of bibliographic information here. Visibility of bibliographic data in Discovery Services is back there. So number 4 is that table right in front of the camera. Five. Did we go back to this side? I can't see the numbers. 5 is over here. Okay. 5 is metadata quality. Open access discovery. Archived content is here. Interoperability of non-textual is 7. Do I have that right? Okay. Yes. 9, linked to open data coexisting with vendor business models. And multiple formats is 10. So 10 got moved over to there. Does everyone have a table? Okay. Okay. So, I have to say I'm very impressed with how quickly you all organized yourselves, moved to a particular table. Self-organizing communities, I appreciate it. What's also interesting is the democratic movement away from certain topics. Now, can I get everybody's attention just for a minute? What we'd like you to do in the next hour that we have is you have a theme of midterm, say, issues related to discovery services. And by midterm, we're talking 18 to 36 months. So what kind of problems do you foresee in your particular theme? Is that data interoperability? Is it exchange? Is it file formats? Is it the interaction with Google Scholar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So identify what are the handful of issues particular to, sorry? Una momentito? Okay.
You said we would start at 3:45.
Okay. No.
Is that okay? So you can just keep talking for 7 minutes.
We can keep talking for 7 minutes. We're going to stretch it out. One of the joys of working with video files is they're huge. So, back on track. What we want you to do, you have a theme, think about that theme, think about what are issues specific to that theme. Identify the issues, hopefully actionable issues, things that there could be something done about. There's many issues that we've discussed and that we could discuss, some of which are not really appropriate for NISO, some of which are not really realistic in terms of achieving. Maybe that's why no one's sitting at this table. But ideally what we'd like is each of the tables to report out on what those themes and issues were, and potentially, is there anything you think we can do about it? Okay, because at the end of the day, what we want to do is fill up that list of what can NISO do about it? What can NISO achieve? What can we as a community achieve to improve these services for the publishers who are creating content, the discovery service providers that are dealing with these issues, and then also how can we improve the service to to the library patrons? So, with that in mind, does anyone have any questions? Just kind of extend this out for a couple more minutes. Does anybody have any questions about what we're asking you all to do? Seem pretty straightforward? Well, we're recording this. So, but first of all, would every table, ideally, can have a note taker, a reporter? So, amongst yourselves, point out the person who has the best handwriting or the best presentation skills. Ideally, at the end of this, what we'd like is the reporter to come up here and just say a few words about a summary of what you've all discussed. In an ideal world, if you could create those documents in an electronic format that could be sent to us. I know, I'm getting picky. Or alternatively, if you have nice handwriting, you can just give us a piece of paper and we can transcribe them. Because we do also want to create a kind of narrative report of this meeting and produce that as well as the white paper. So, A, for each table or reporter, be someone who's willing to stand up and just say, this is what we talked about for 45 minutes to an hour. And someone who's not shy about being on a camera. Any other questions? No? Okay. There we go. You have your task. Let's go at it. If you guys need anything, just raise your hand or throw something. We'll pay some attention to you. Okay? All right. Great. Let's go. Oh, one more just little note. We have posted all of the presentation slides already on the NISO website for this event, so they're all publicly available. I noticed a few people taking pictures of the slides. That's fine, but you know, the presentations are already up and available, so you can get access to them even now if you'd like. Okay? All right. Thanks. One special bit for you all. You have two mics. If you have something to say, just speak into the mic because they need the mics to hear you. There is a note. There's like a live stream social aspect to there's like a IRC channel that's associated with the live stream. We can get some of that as well. What I'll do is I will ask them to kill the mics in the room so it'll still go out over the network. But if you grab it. Any other questions? I mean, there's more or less there's just a camera and they're watching you guys and listening to what you guys are saying. Yes. So, excuse me.
Right. That's why I wasn't sure if we were going to get in the IRC with them.
Yeah, so right, we're not necessarily talking to them in any way.
I'm not clear. I think they're going to try and give us the ability to dial in. Yeah,
Maybe come sit with us, but we're
Hey, Todd? Does Nettie have access to the IRC? Or the IRC Lite?
I'll get Juliana over here. She does.
put that down.
So we need a note taker slash presenter. I don't know if that has to be the same person or not. So since I've already spoken today, I will opt out.
I have messy handwriting.
Does anybody?
I don't mind taking notes.
Okay.
Probably won't get your mic.
I'm happy to present.
Okay.
Let's go. Or Jeff.
No,
Jeff,
go
will give you
ahead.
the opportunity.
I know. It's
You can do rock, paper, scissors. Stop.
well, since you're going to present, you can start us off. I don't even know how we're starting off.
Well, I think that
That's the way it's going to work. You won't be able to hear. It's just going to go like this.
Oh, really?
Right? Because otherwise everybody else will be confused by it.
Right. Juliana is going to be our tether to the world.
Yeah, so this isn't just like a bunch of
so. Both microphones work. Okay.
Then I'll tell you.
yeah.
Okay.
The problem is I keep getting it picked off. I may not be the right person, so I'll do the best I can. Go ahead, sorry.
That's all right. It's quite all right. We need to get the logistics down. Well, so I think that we need to start with the themes and the issues, right? Is kind of what it comes down to. So we're talking about increased visibility of library holdings and commercial search engines. And go ahead.
And maybe we want to define the terms commercial search engines. That's probably the easy one.
Yeah.
And library holdings. That one's more complex. And I
It
think
is more complex.
so.
Yeah, I think, right from the get-go, it'd be, you start with, when we say holdings, are we talking about holdings of a work, manifestation, right? What are we actually saying that we're going to have holdings for?
Right, and I'm hoping we would potentially expand that beyond holdings that would be traditionally registered in a library catalog and often then synced with WorldCat and available to some extent in that way, beyond that to other content that the libraries have and
Right.
might want to expose via those search engines. So I don't know, articles. So almost it's like the issue for me, and I'm not sure that's where the table wants to go, and I know the folks online voted for this one, so I don't want to take it too far away from library holdings, but to me, I think in order to make discovery services relevant, we have two options to get users there. We have the option of trying to convince them to start there, or the option of having them start there and then end up somehow using a discovery system. So if they are drawn in somehow by commercial search engines being aware of those holdings and then somehow drawing the user back into library resources and library discovery systems, that's an important second path that I think we might want to think about.
So in this case, commercial discovery services is defined as Google.
Not discovery services. So there's commercial search engines, right? So when I think of Google, there's Bing and there's others. But because the majority of our users start their research in a commercial search engine, how then do they get to our traditional library holdings, which I think we have some experience with mainly through WorldCat at this point, as far as I know, but then also to other library holdings, anything the library is paying for to some extent is how I would like to expand the discussion to include not just catalog
not just
records,
monographs.
but broader set of things.
Would you expand that beyond what the library may hold into what the library may curate?
Right. I think it is anything the library wants to provide access to, right? So, however the library defines its holdings is, I think, what we're talking about here. If you think about the goal of discovery being to get your users to the content that they need for whatever research project or class assignment that they're working on. But we also know that they're starting with Google and not starting with the library website. Ideally, Google would get them to everything, and it would get them to the library stuff. However you manage to do that is the tricky
Yeah, because
part.
it could be a collection of something. I mean, it could be a database a local database that a library holds. I think I was talking with somebody from UCLA they've got a big archive of news feeds that they've collected. Now that turns out you actually have to use them on campus, but it could be that just knowing that exists, it wouldn't necessarily be the individual discrete items within it, but it could be at if you look at the Google model, it's a combination of low-level items and large-level themes, or it could be genres, it could be types, it could be all different kinds of formats.
Okay, so for the live stream, I'm just going to reiterate that we're talking about increased visibility of library holdings in commercial search engines. And now we're trying to define what those terms mean. So what library holdings means and what commercial search engines means. And we think that commercial search engines is essentially Google and Bing. And maybe that's about
80%,
it.
85%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then library holdings is, I think, a trickier one, and we're going to tease that out.
Yeah.
So one of the things we've been working on for the last year and a half is focused around this visibility. And one of the key points has been with WorldCat, there's been a level of trying to understand library data within Google, Bing, and others, mobile interfaces and such, like Ido talked about earlier today. But one of the statements that was made, and kind of an opportunity here, is if libraries' catalogs, for example, were harvestable today, the engines could actually come in, start to use those. And when we've had those discussions with them, the first place they go to is, can you give me live access to all of these folks' resources? They want to be able to, similar to a movie theater, be able to represent real-time holdings or real-time access. And so it's kind of an evolution and an opportunity when it comes to things like BibFrame and whatnot. We've started to talk about vocabularies, and archives is another one that's right on the cusp of it. So relative to one of the other points that we were talking about today, which is what something NISO could do, extending BibFrame beyond MARC, those types of things to make sure that that full view of whatever we call the collections is an opportunity maybe for NISO, just to sort of throw that out there. So it gives a vocabulary that you can put out there to the web. You can translate to something like schema.org, and the individual libraries can actually say, this is what I've got, or their providers can do it on their behalf, is one thought that's come up in the research we've been doing. So. Any thoughts on that?
And we are just talking about holdings and not availability.
Right, initially. Yeah. But I think the exciting thing about it long term, what we've found is when we talk about commercial search engines, very quickly it's starting to turn into Cortana, it's starting versus Bing. Mm-hmm. So Cortana lives inside of the OS. It's turning into mobile search where, I land someplace, and if I've landed in a city that's got an archive nearby regarding a topic that I'm interested in, I think Ito used the example, I'm walking by the library and it says my holdings are available, or my book's available. Mm-hmm. Same sort of thing could happen if I'm a researcher nearby a special collection I wouldn't have seen otherwise. So how do we make sure we're injecting all of that into the web, basically? So there's certainly commercial related issues for licensed content and those kinds of things too.
So then one of the first issues that comes up is, how do they create the data, and outside of or from an ILS, for example, that might not support exporting the data in the right format, and then is there a need for a third-party service in the middle that does some of that for them, or is it you're all going to be dependent upon the vendors of all those systems to be able to deliver on the code that does that?
So I think that's a good question about capability and where does the capability reside to actually make a difference here. I've come from JISC and Neil Grindley from JISC. We've been talking to OCLC recently and hearing about all the stuff you've done with SEO and schema.org. That's come from OCLC's own initiative, is it, or has it come from pressure from libraries?
We did that a long time ago. Jeff would probably know the history better than I would, I believe. But it's been going, 2006 was when we launched WorldCat.org. I think the holdings themselves, I'm not sure when that particular part of the feature made its appearance. I mean, was it from the beginning? Yeah. Right. We actually go and we know what the holdings are, and we represent them in a way that a user can actually go and click through to get to them, but they're not represented. What you're saying is in a way that they could be consumed.
Right. Yeah. It's sort of there's two models in place. So to your point, one was the way that WorldCat.org was designed would be if you were able to say collectively, here's where all the world's libraries are, and then you optimize that site to try and drive traffic in. The other option that could be a complement is that the libraries themselves have their data out there, and so someone could get to it either direction. So for example, in Boston, there were a set of students who could get anything across their consortia, but instead of having to know how to use each of those libraries, they found content on worldcat.org and could then, as Mike said, locate items from across the consortia that they could get access to using worldcat.org instead of using 10 different sites. So that's kind of a direct-to-consumer model. An alternative would be that if those 10 sites also had their data out in a form that Google or others could actually understand it, you could end up with a complement. So you have one that's a direct-to-consumer site, the other that sits inside of engines, such that if Cortana is my research assistant and I'm able to say, I'm researching this topic, it knows my history, it knows all about me personally, and it starts to knit together things. So both kind of complement one another there. Does that make sense, Dan? And that's where schema.org, for example, is an interesting opportunity, back to the NISO side. Schema.org is a commercial engine vocabulary, so there's opportunities for bridging to that, but there's also an opportunity to make sure we're describing it thoroughly enough that we can use it inside of our own systems within our own industry, and then able to crosswalk over into Open Graph, into all these other different systems. The schema is there today, but something else will be there tomorrow as well. So, and all of the vendors have got schema. By vendors, I mean Google, Microsoft. They've got schema, and then they extend it. So they have their own versions of schema that there's a baseline, but then they extend it further. So if you're working with Google Scholar, you might have additional things. If you're working with Microsoft Education or Classroom, you might have additional things. So there's an opportunity for us to do a lot of crosswalk work there. I think that's a standard type activity.
Yeah, and using schema.org, we exposed work level data, right, at the work level. Did not on the holding side. Is that But we detect basically on the WorldCat.org search. We detect the IP. We know which libraries actually hold it, and we give them the ability to be able to click through and find it in the catalog on the other side to check for availability. Yep. And that's a once you get into the mode of having to interoperate with third-party systems, there's the potential for could be bad metadata, it could be bad knowledge about what the holdings actually are. And so that creates a barrier there from ultimate most efficient use.
Well, and one of the things I was curious to throw to the table, in terms of the short-term problems, it seems like licensed content. What anybody want to opine on sort of licensed content versus catalogs? So there are dark catalogs that exist, but generally you'd say, well, our catalog is publicly available, our special collections are publicly available, so if you want the search engines to crawl it, they could. But what have you all run into as it relates to licensed content that may not be currently publicly crawlable? Have the commercial search engines given suggestions on that? Sorry, you get to speak for that.
Oh, okay. I guess I'll speak for the commercial search engines. We're, the owners of the content are in the end making the decisions on what can be put out or what can't be, right? And I think a lot of publishers are obviously exposing content out to commercial search engines now, and that seems to be working fairly well with the link resolvers and all that stuff coming back in. And we're doing some of that too, but as it relates to our ability to do that through licenses that we might have. And so I think you see that from all of the... Sorry. I think you're seeing that as it relates to all of those who have some stake in the content game, is that folks are exposing content to Google and search engines as they can. If it's your own proprietary content, certainly you control that. But if it's publisher content that you're aggregating, then it really falls under the realm of, is this ours to actually provide?
And that's where I was just going to say, the comment was made in one of the earlier sessions about limiting it to the catalog, but I think that's part of the reason that if we can get an industry vocabulary started and get some momentum going, that's where the catalog or some of those things that have fewer issues while other business models evolve. Like you said, there's some of these scenarios where whole new license agreements have to be put in place and new models start to evolve, but once you get some gravity going, you can actually start to build on that as well. So, I'm sorry, Jason.
It's okay. So one way I guess I think about, other than WorldCat.org type access to library holdings from the open web, I think about doing a search in Google, having either Google Scholar or Google Books come up, and then that driving you into an area that provides broadened access to the kind of content that the library has. So the Find a My Library button that's in there in Google Books, which I admit I haven't looked at in many years. I know it's always been kind of problematic, but that's one way that I can think about somebody who's one of my users who's out on the web being able to get into an ebook that I am licensing or other kinds of results. And so I don't know if there are other examples of things that have happened since then about ways that that could happen. Because Google Scholar, the other thing, if you do a search that looks like a scholarly article search, Google will pop up a couple of results at the top that are Scholar, and then it'll drag you into Scholar, which usually is helpful, presumably, right? So, are there other models of how you can get to library content from the open web that don't depend on Google configuring it in a way that you can do that? I mean, I know putting your records out there, as we've talked about, but given the limits of license agreements with publishers and aggregators, one of the things I think about is how do we get them into aggregate content? That's important too, and we're kind of stuck in trying to do that. So it's kind of a naive question, but I think it's what I think about when I think of this issue.
I think there's two examples we've run into. One, if you noticed in Bing, Microsoft Research had shared with us their A/B testing, and now in Bing, if you do a search for some of the most widely commercially held items, specific libraries that are nearby are showing up in options as well as Overdrive content, right next to Amazon and other things. And it's sort of an experiment they're doing just to sort of see about placement. So that's one model. The other is they're talking about if there was a level of uniformity in what they were able to digest, that putting it into the graph and those sort of answers starts to become an increasing option. So,
what was the data they were using to be able to do the experiment? What was the data they were able to using to be able to do the experiment?
they were doing two things. One is at one point we had given them a dump of the registry, so they already had that within there. They had some level of WorldCat holdings that was a couple years out, and then they also went with widely held items that allowed them to sort of say,
Predict.
roughly we'd assume these folks have it. With Overdrive, it's a direct harvest, so they're actually able to go in and do that. And that was where the discussion started into, if there's a way for us to actually get the content from all of these, we'd love to do that. And then if there's an action script towards availability, we'd love that. And so they started to just brainstorm some ideas at CNI related to that.
Yeah, it seems like being able to predict at the head level would be relatively simple.
Right. I mean, they were looking at it as out in the commercial web, there's a lot of things like, inventory at Sears and Dell's inventory and those types of things. And they were saying, at its most fundamental level, if I thought of libraries as having stuff, can you tell me what you've got?
But I'm curious though, I mean, typically when you look at a retailer, for example, because that's, I think, a really good comparison, because it's local inventory of the same items. And so there are approximately 2,000 Home Depots in the country. They all sell the same stuff. They all have the same SKUs for the most part. So if you're looking for screwdrivers, a particular kind of screwdriver, and it's at Home Depot, Google's likely to show you a link to a Home Depot page that's basically at the manifestation level, right? It's like but it doesn't give it to you. It doesn't tell you that it's in your specific store necessarily. It sends you to a deep link into Home Depot, where you then say, I'm in this zip code, or here's the nearest store, right?
The example I'd use though is more like with movie theaters now. If you actually do a search for a film title, it can actually, because Fandango and others are acting as aggregation.
The difference with that, Jeff, would be that the scale of the number of things in the market at any given time for movies isn't a few orders of magnitude fewer than even Home Depot SKUs, right? As soon as you move up the food chain, up into the retailer or into common stuff that everybody has, the numbers just dwarf what goes on with movies. Movies are always like popped out there as the thing to do, but how many in any given time? 30, 40 movies? And they're in every location, but it's still a very small number of the actual kind of work level, right?
Well, and that's why I was using the example of archives.
Yeah.
So for example, when you go up into Boston, they've got a number of really nice archives at Boston University that they're the exclusive holder, but if they had a sense of demand, they said, we can put that out there. The other example that came up at a conference was demand-driven acquisition. And Overdrive, there was some discussion around that where put everything out that I've got, and when I click on it, charge me for it. And so it's the idea that libraries could be frontline support or frontline support for the users up to X and then stop showing me. And so the opportunity, I think, with commercial engines is both describing what we've got, but maybe policies become part of that as well. Because when we talked with them, they were saying, well, if you can have a state we can geofence the state, and to your earlier point, if the state of Michigan licensed a set of EBSCO content, perhaps the state of Michigan is able to actually show in commercial engines with all that content because they understand how to understand policy. Might be something that's out there. So it's description of the content, but also description of the policy and access.
Yeah, being able to know rights is
Right.
right.
And the geo policies. And
With the public library, the use case seems simpler only because whatever they have, you can go borrow, and if you're in the area that the library, is in. So.
I have a couple of questions that might take us in a slightly different direction. So before I ask them, does anybody else at the table want to comment on that? I don't want to monopolize. Okay. Couple things that just came up, and they're more, I'm seeing the big picture now, which I haven't even really seen that before, so that's kind of exciting. But things that I think might contribute to that big picture of who has what to some extent, I think, that we may need in order to expose what we have more effectively to open web searches. One is, how well is the registry maintained, and how do commercial search engines know, when you're in a library or not? Because I remember the days of maintaining our OCLC registry information as from an individual library and realizing that our IP addresses were out of date and that wasn't necessarily kept up. So one thing is there something NISO could do in that area? And I don't know that it's changing the way we do it, but maybe raising the visibility of the fact that it matters, and maybe leveraging, well, this registry is being used by all these other things, so you don't just do it for WorldCat or OCLC, you do it for a broader set potentially. That's one thought. And then the other thought is based on the SKUs, which made me think OCLC number, which made me think, is there something else in terms of holdings? I know that OCLC has done a lot, that dived into it in the past and then come right back out again. I'm no expert, but with XISBN and work IDs and being able to connect different versions of books, all those sorts of things together. Is there, and then I also know there's some frustration with OCLC numbers and trying to take collections that libraries have and make them work with the fact that many of them don't have them or they don't know how to get them, that sort of thing. Is there something that NISO or could do around the identifier? So those are just two general areas that I think sound like they'd be of importance in this broader discussion.
So you want NISO to create a new identifier for
I would hope it wouldn't be that, but
NISO ID. Just asking.
I am not calling.
Jason,
I am not calling for that. I am asking the question, given that the issue is that the de facto standard for identifying your holdings, more or less, is OCLC number.
Yeah. I mean, because giving out an ID is relatively easy, right? Once you start, you just increment forward. It's the coordination of what you do with the IDs afterwards, how they actually get implemented and executed at the local level, and then at the scale, right? It's the scale that actually where issues start, manifesting themselves a little bit.
It sounds like we're calling for maybe like a domain registry. Like you register URLs now instead of maybe a library registry, a domain registry, URL registry.
Oh. Well, the registry itself.
That's a different.
Yeah,
that's the other topic, right?
Topic,
so, just I guess
it is a good point about the updates and whether libraries maintain it. I off the top of my head, I don't know. I wish I did, but don't know.
Is that the only way that a user is identified as being a part of a library, other than, I mean, from a search in a Google search, right? In Google Scholar, you can go in and say, Google Scholar, I'm associated with X institution. So that's within that silo. You can say who you are.
You do have to.
But
you have to affiliate, right?
That's right. You have.
Because if I'm in Seattle, I can be Seattle and King County libraries both, but I'm not Pierce County. But I could be in the IP detection could actually put me into the Pierce County area when in fact I'm not and there's also cases of like and this is just Seattle, I know this, years ago I worked in the Seattle Public Library circulation system. So there are specific areas within King County where they used to be able to get a Seattle city public card, but some areas couldn't because they didn't pay the right taxes or something. So you could actually be in King County and you were excluded from getting the Seattle card.
Right, so I guess the question I'm asking is, is IP recognition of who you're associated, of which library you're associated with, handled in any different way than either county or state, as we just talking about the geofencing, or the OCLC registry, and is the OCLC registry being used by more than just worldcat.org to identify which library a user is associated with?
Don't know. I don't know.
But it does seem like something around the registry and libraries understanding the importance of the registry for this might be a valuable direction.
I had a quick question for maybe for EBSCO, ProQuest, and others. Is what we found over the last year and a half is that the registry exists and there are uses that we were putting forth there, but almost every provider also has some version of an equivalent customer administration console or something like that where they're managing.
They keep IP addresses because you need them for detection for permissions.
Right. So the idea being that, and again, I'm not sure. I think it's in the EBSCO consoles, and ProQuest may have something similar. But it's the idea that if every one of your providers, if you're maintaining something somewhere, at least being able to contribute that to this known space is kind of, again, back to a NISO piece.
I definitely support the notion of some registration in some way to identify, to link the library. We have multiple ways to authenticate in, and it's not just IP range. It could be from your cookie. It could be from referring URL. It could be we recognize, library cards as they're entered. So it would be hard to unravel, all the methods that are in place. But I do think, having some way to declare, perhaps maybe even your preferred method of being recognized, makes a lot of sense.
And I'm flashing back to some sort of institutional identifier. Right now, I would Google it if I wasn't trying to pass mics around.
Well,
but I know that there have been efforts to this in this direction in the past.
There is one. There's I'm drawing a blank because it came up during with Plum when we were looking at funding and institutions. So there is some sort of institutional ID.
Anyway, it does seem like enabling major commercial search engines to identify automatically the academic or even public library that the user is associated with would be a valuable thing that NISO could look at again to see where we are and figure out if there are paths where it makes sense to really invest in that to drawing users into our stream more effectively.
And that's where back to the inside out, outside in part of this is, if you were to talk to Google at one point, it's the Google Plus identity, and that's how you're able to tell hours and all that because you own your identity and manage it. Yelp's the same way. Everybody's got authenticated, I'm the authorized real user. And so the idea of being able to say, well, that's in that space, if that's the audience we're talking about visibility with, but then for all the providers that they would need to be able to interop with, can we do a contributing crosswalk where somebody actually says, yep, that Google Plus identity is the same as this, and here's all the other values I'm able to send through, so they can do something meaningful with it.
So can we summarize some of what the themes so far that we've come up with? I mean, we spent a lot of time here on recognizing a user where they were, which has importance. That's assuming that we have all the holdings and that the search engines have consumed them. Who's taking the notes? What was the?
But I really couldn't hear very well, so I was going to take this opportunity.
Speak up.
Okay.
Yes. The comment from the stream is from Lucy Harrison. Well, in case they can, that means if you guys can hear what's on the stream, presume mobile first, and it seems like a combination of GPS self-ID is the way. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's connecting the user though to the.
That's the identification of the user via mobile.
Yeah.
And then you turn around and say, okay, now that I've identified them geo somehow.
What are they,
right.
It comes back to the rights and permissions and how we know that that they can get access to something. Yeah.
Right. Yep.
But it does place them. The GPS places them specifically in a very small area versus
Right.
versus IP detection,
that?
which is harder. Yes, right.
Right. Well, that's one of the use cases that's come up is start with my physical location and then personalize me to my device ID if I affiliate and those kinds of things. So.
Yeah.
Did you hear the themes to your earlier question, Mike?
Yeah. So I didn't hear. I mean, so there's identity, right? There's and location of the user, of the individual user, and then there's the knowledge about search engine knowledge about rights and permissions, right? Like if you can place that person in a physical location, what can you presume that they have access to?
Right, and then there's the how do I understand the content?
Right.
And the content can fall from typical inventory, special collections, licensed content, which then blends into rights.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Anything else?
I don't know. I shudder to bring it up again, but I think the idea of the object identifier, and granted, there's so many objects that we want to provide access to that don't have those identifiers. Although more are rising. Right? We have DOI, we have OCLC number for books for the extent that that's effective. I think. And these are such broad themes. It seems obvious. I know that NISO knows that these are important things for them to work on. I'm just trying to sort of push at how those themes that are things that clearly NISO works on relate to this specific issue of exposing library holdings and library content to the commercial search engines. So I guess that would be another theme, is not just identifying the user, but also somehow being able to say that the item that I have and the item that you have is the same item, so that there is a landing page like a Home Depot landing page for a SKU that directs you to, does my local library have it, that could happen some way other than being dependent on the current means of navigating that path, which is really difficult for users, I think.
Yeah.
At least it was.
Well, I mean, once you go down if you look at a great use case that I had while I was coming here was I was staying at the Radisson last night, about a mile and a half away. Using Gmail, Google knows that I was staying at the Radisson because the email showed up into my Gmail account, and so when I searched for Radisson Baltimore, it popped up in the search results. You're staying here at this one, because there were more than one, right? And it knew that. So I knew it, Radisson knew it, Google knew it, the NSA knew it. And so that's a huge presumption of privacy that did not exist in any of those exchanges, and but I allowed that to happen. Whereas on the library side, a little bit slightly different. If there's issues related to that, I don't know, but.
From the live stream again, this comment from Lucy Harrison again. It's hard to have this conversation with questions. Is that WQ with questions actually involving the search engines themselves?
Maybe that's without. Maybe it's supposed to be
without?
WO.
Yeah, how about that? Without. Without, not with Q. Thanks, Lucy. Seems like they'd have solutions already that we could piggyback on.
And I mean, it's fair to say a number of us are talking with them, and that's where forums like NISO or whatnot that could give them a consistent way to interact, and that's where I was thinking the identifiers. One of the benefits is if it's not a matter of finding the identifier, but if you identify the 20, they know how to deal with equivalence. They're fine with that. They're fine with good enough, and so a forum for that conversation. She raises a very good point.
Yeah, I mean, their goal is to give answers to end users, the same as a library, and they want to do it in the most efficient way possible. And they need some common way to be able to exchange data and know about it. They also want to be relatively complete, I would assume. So it's a definite issue. So Jeff, BibFrame.
I mean, part of the interesting thing from our point of view with BibFrame has been that as a replacement for MARC, it's a starter for a conversation, but we've already started looking at modeling BibFrame for events, for locations, for archives, licensed content, and the nice thing is it's effectively self-healing. So you get it wrong or you get it roughly right, and then you evolve it. And so we've started sort of the idea of having a discussion here about what would be the value of community-driven profiles. So LC's focused on some things. There's LD for L, LD for P, those types of things that are happening. We have an activity that we put forth we've got like 400 institutions we've worked with that have gone through our training, and it's at bibfra.me, so bibframe with a period before the ME. But it shows the idea that you could start with a kernel of a profile description like NLM. We'd worked with them and some others, and then we said, oh, what about the archive community? Oh, well, they'd want this too. What about the fill in blank community? Oh, they'd want this too. And so it's an extensible model where you could bring groups together on a regular basis and say, this is what's been working well enough, and someone pokes a hole in it or whatnot, but it's like early HTML. It's allowed to be more than the blessed standard. So there's an opportunity, I think, for NISO and the community to really evolve quite a bit there, very, very rapidly. So thanks for teeing that up, Mike. Wasn't sure if that was a hallway conversation or this one. So.
Not anymore.
Juliana is currently looking at your screen.
No, I'm trying to figure out if we need to go to 4:45. We started at 3:45. It's an hour. Whoever's got the microphone, just ask if anybody on the live stream has any questions.
Does anyone on the live stream have any questions?
Did Todd give a time we were supposed to regroup? We did not. Okay, so before we report out.
I think so, but I'm gonna go find out. So y'all talk amongst yourself. Yeah, just watch, just in case something comes up.
So I've got this question in my mind about the openness of metadata and how open it is at the moment. I hear different things in the UK about when we put this aggregation together of UK library data, can we just go ahead and assert CC0 on library cataloging metadata? It seems to me surely we should be able to. And what's the feeling around the table about that? Because obviously it has big implications for how it gets out there, how the whole kind of data ecosystem flows.
And it's funny you mention it, so that's why I grabbed out the mic, because this is part of the reason I was saying if one of the discussion points that came up in some focus sessions we did was if catalogs worked the way they should, and that was sort of a loaded statement somebody made, a harvester should be able to come in and meaningfully harvest the page, right? And so part of what people were saying is if an institution can put an equivalent harvestable version of their catalog out, it should be able to sit under open harvesting content, right? If it's a discovery system where there's policy related to it, then that certainly has got a firewall related issue and whatnot. But the idea of taking all of those institutions' information and then asserting ownership against it starts to get sticky. I mean, that's just easy. But if the institution themselves is basically saying, in the interim of my system not being harvestable or decorated in a meaningful way, I want to put an equivalent out, everything we're seeing is it falls right under their rights to do that. So that's the reason I was saying it's the difference between a direct-to-consumer and helping the libraries tell their own story within their own context, because it's making up for a deficiency in a given system right now, is one way that people have characterized it. If it was meaningfully harvestable, the web could already do something with it. It's not, therefore it seems invisible, and the library's content is not found by the web. So if you can make up for that within the context of that library, it's totally within rights to publish the way you're describing. But you got to be careful, because if you're a consortia and you aggregate 20 people, 20 sites, and 10 of them really paid a lot of extra money to build out dramatic metadata records, and the others have tremendously sparse ones. Can you now say, well, no, all 20 deserve it? You're going to get into a sticky pickle there.
Yeah, I mean, it's precisely the problem we have with COPAC, which is an aggregation of 80, 90 libraries. And I guess there's a sense that, yes, you've got to put something in order to kind of take advantage in some senses, but you could just, put your very sparse records in, and in a relatively cynical way, perhaps. But yeah, I mean, it's something that we're very interested in trying to work through, and I guess maybe it's going beyond the library, or saying to the library, okay, we want you to assert CC0. Who do you think? Where's the problems? Which publishers, which aggregators you getting your records from?
And
Can
what
you
enrichment?
point us, JISC, in the direction so that we can go and broker,
Right.
have the conversation with these people, and whether there's some way of doing that via some data way or some standard way, I don't know.
And it gets to the way that record enrichment is happening too. So folks get records delivered by their vendors, but then they actually, in many cases, folks are paying extra to get a whole bunch of other stuff done to it before it's put into their catalogs. And that's why when you look at two of them, one may be a very rich record and somebody else's may be more sparse. It may be a scenario where as an aggregator, just you could go into their provider and say, what would you be interested in getting paid to do this for the whole of our cooperative?
Yeah.
So that's new business models that start to emerge as a result of this.
Yeah.
So what did you discover on timing?
You have about 15 more minutes, so basically keep talking.
To be able to report back, I just want to be sure that we got the.
Yeah, that might be a good idea.
I'm not doing it that long, but actually speaking to the.
All right, I'm just trying to aim at people.
So on the note side, then, wanted to be sure we've got, like if we should review where we're at on the themes, the issues, and then walk down whether we've got something this, and then kind of like part of it is where NISO fits in. Should we look at this from the point of view of like where we think the biggest opportunity is?
Yeah, he said a handful of issues, specific and actionable, potentially by NISO. So.
Yeah.
I can also say that he would also like owners, meaning if you've got the idea, also think about some ownership of the idea as well.
Todd.
I didn't know we had to sign up for anything.
Like table 10's looking awfully good right now.
How did they get roped into this table again?
The short straw.
So where did the notes end up?
Mine are like
So-
for me because they're not making sense.
Yeah, my notes aren't
I hear
terribly
things
good
around
either, but-
identities, registration.
No, mine. I mean, I'm just looking at some of the themes that we've talked about, and
Method of action.
I'm wondering whether there's an advice and guidance piece around here as well for NISO. I don't know about the scope of what NISO does or can achieve, but there's presumably advice, guidance, training that seems to, be relevant to some of these things that we've talked about.
I think where
Not least-
ODI started to go was in that direction. It was less about prescriptive A standard and more about best practices. When I was on D2D, we were trying to do more and more of that kind of guidance, like you say.
Definitely. Not to say something more concrete could come of it, but guidance is definitely, yeah.
I mean, just what comes out of thinking through the definitions. I mean, we started talking about, well, really, what are we talking about when we're talking about holdings? I mean, there's still quite a lot of work to be done, certainly in UK libraries, just about people in libraries getting straight about what we all mean by some terms that are kind of thrown around in forums like this, where there's a lot of experts in the room, but actually it doesn't actually translate very well to library practitioners sometimes.
We had a question on the subject of something along those lines from the live stream. What about having NISO facilitate a conversation between libraries and search engines?
Yes.
We're all
yes.
saying yes.
Let the record show there was not.
So, in terms of ideas, one other thing that comes up for me when I think about this issue is that in some cases, users are on the open web, they click a result, and they are using something the library has paid for without having any idea that that's the case. And so if you flip this question on its head almost, I'm not sure it's even that closely related, but ultimately I think there might be a space for NISO in improving the ability of libraries to communicate funding support, basically, that they have, that their library is paying for this item from searches that come in from the open web. And I know that's stretching this discussion a bit, but I mean, in some cases that the connection already exists, but library users aren't aware of that, and that's really important for the ultimate question of to what extent do libraries play a role in the future of the content game. That is, I mean, if users don't know that the money we're spending is providing them access to content, then the level of support that prevents library budgets from being cut to pay for that content would be reduced. So it seems to me that there might be, so to make it really concrete, and I'm not sure how closely this connects to the discussion, but we ran out of things to say, so I'm going to say it anyway. So, you know, watermarking branding PDFs, that sort of thing, where every time that you're accessing content or downloading content from any publisher site or any aggregator site, it's clear that that content came from and was funded by the library. I think that piece of things, which we've had ability to brand sites, most folks can put their logo up for many IP identified, usage, but the PDF is still, in many cases, at least in the electronic world, the endpoint, and to have a way to standardize that effort to communicate on the end product level, this product was paid for by your library, seems another just possible area that NISO could investigating being part of. I don't know if others, I know there are a few content providers that do allow and set it up so that so that happens automatically when it's downloaded within the IP range. But I know there's only a couple, and I feel like that's maybe one example of flipping the question entirely on its head and saying this is something else NISO could do that's really important, that would point out the case where there already are connections between where the user starts and the content they end up with, but they never know that that's coming from the library. And I don't know. I think there's room there maybe. Thoughts, anybody?
Yeah, I mean, I was going through kind of what are the themes, and that might fall under policies of attribution. And sort of, the idea that there's policies of access, policies of attribution, description of collections, catalog, archives, special collections, licensed content, but if you get those categories down, attribution seems like an appropriate one that has best practices as well as policies.
I think that makes sense, and I'm curious about the ideas of, so somebody finds, we figure out the whole upstream part of it, right? So somebody finds something and they realize it's from you, or they're able to access it, they get into your library, and you actually give them directly to that record level, right? So maybe that record has a watermark on it, but how did you expose them to where that came, just sort of one step back upstream? So they went from Google, let's just say, to the record itself that lives on Publisher X site, and it says that this was paid by the library, maybe that works, but then how do I find the rest of this stuff that I could see that is other stuff like it? Did I bypass the stopping point like a discovery service for your library in the context maybe of that thing?
And this is, really quickly, this is where also there are services out there like if you say, I want to watch X movie, and if you look even right now in search engines or solution finders, I'll call it that, because it'll say, here's the movie, and if you got Netflix, click here, you're going to watch it there. Amazon Instant, click here, and you can buy it from Apple iTunes, and it just turns into an opportunity that you could have a direct-to-consumer buy. You could say, authenticate or associate to your library, and if you do that, you get it free. And all of a sudden the library gets that attribution of, well, I'm a student from here, or I'm a citizen from here, but that's all policy. So anyway, sorry, Jason.
Yeah, so I think this is an exciting area. I don't know what the NISO support would be, but the idea that they've gotten to a single result, and how do we encourage them to go forward instead of back, kind of, right? So they could go back to Google where they came from and be back lost in a broader land, which may or may not be helpful, but how is it once they've hit that one result, they can go someplace? And so my experience has been, and it makes sense with stickiness and competitive issues, if they end up in a platform, they want to keep them in that platform. But ideally, so if I'm on a publisher platform, I would get out to the aggregated collection that includes that publisher's content plus lots of other content, or somehow get into my library. So giving that as another option, and your special case, I think, is an example, is one other area that we should really be thinking about as the various possibilities for how we encourage this. I haven't thought about that much, but I think there could be a place there for a general tool or software that would support that case that's similar to, you found a movie, here are the various places you can get it, that wouldn't be dependent on Google. And that's what I'm asking for, is because the one that's dependent on Google is we have no control over it at all. But what about one where we have more control over that? And so existing on the publisher side, existing in any place within the library collections that a user is, would be really helpful.
Yeah, and I wonder if, I don't know if this is the goal necessarily, but if you started in Google and you found the article, that's great. I'm going to go back to Google and start again, as opposed to if I found the article through Google and then realized it was from the library and they exposed me to this larger thing. Now, Google is being used not to drive traffic to your results, but to drive traffic into resources that may help that individual researcher actually find more great things the library has and use the library's services. And so now I'm in the library services and I'm doing what Google didn't skip you and kind of give you access to the stuff you bought. It actually brought you into the fray and said, hey, now you can search the stuff that actually means something to you and realize what the library has to offer.
Those themes, or do you want to compare and contrast over? I think the big thing is really on the NISO side was where this is where I'm at right here.
I think we're just
With
trying to
themes and issues, identity of person placed in a physical location, which is basically which library, boundaries of library related to who has access, public versus academic. And we got formatting the accessibility of knowledge of the content, bibframe, schema.org.
Yeah, I think in some of those there was the extension of, into collection descriptions.
So as a NISO opportunity?
As a NISO opportunity, a community of profile extensions that represent the library's content and crosswalk it into the areas we want to show up in or be visible in.
Very good. Okay. All right.
That might be what the library has access to.
What others?
Let's see. The role of NISO on identifiers. And it would be maybe identifier inventories, because it doesn't mean declaring an identifier, it means saying these are identifiers and here's the potential relationships.
Hi, live stream.
Inside
Cool.
of libraries and in the
No.
environments we want to participate in.
It's on about a 7-10 second delay. So we are going to reconvene with the larger group.
And did you capture policies?
So I've got policies of attribution. What other ones?
Attribution, access.
I've got access, knowing rights and permissions, statewide deals versus what the library has.
Yeah.
Yep. And then
So we're going to
policies
stop
of
the recording
attribution.
here and reconvene when we do the reporting in just a minute. Okay.
Were sort of the suggestion that
Jeff?
watermarks.
We're gonna kill the recording.
See y'all later.
So you wanna?
I don't know where the. I don't know.
Well, we still have because it had 5 hours. Okay. All right. All right. So just as a quick temperature check, if you thought that was a useful exercise, raise your hand. Excellent. Fantastic. How many of you are lying? Oh, okay. Great. No, I'm just really excited. Yeah, table two wasn't happy about the exercise. Yes, table two. Yeah. And I think there's also a correlation between like where people want to sit. People want to sit towards the back. People don't want to sit in the first few pews. All right, so what we want to do now is we've got about 45 minutes, at least 45 minutes before the wine is set up. So, and apologies to those on the live stream. We couldn't ship wine over the internet. It's. We are live streaming the reporting. Yes. We're going to continue the live stream until about 5:30 or thereabouts, 5:45 maybe, depending on how quickly you all can report. Ending the reporting early won't speed up when the bar is open. Sorry. We could go in order, or does anyone really have an itch to get up and go first? You just want to get it done? Excellent. I am always surprised that there are people who want to stand up and do it first, get it out of the way. So, oddly enough, we go from 1 to 3 because you all raised your hands. Anthony, we'll start. We can be totally informal.
We are going to be totally informal. I don't know how to do formal. So this is table 1. We were talking about vocabularies and standardized vocabularies. And I confess that this went off in a different direction than I expected. We started out with the statement that there's a lot of medical vocabularies and there's LC and all these things. And it led to the conversation that two of the people at our table work at an organization that creates a lot of data. And their concern is more for how to create the data in a way that is consistent and uses standardized vocabularies and standardized data dictionaries, basically. And then how that could then be used in discovery systems, which I was only thinking as an academic library, how do we make all these existing thesauri that are already out there work well together for our students who are searching and our researchers who are searching. So both of these are very valid aspects of talking about a standard vocabulary. And so we talked about both of them. So basically the idea is that as we pour more and more content together into single search environments, our users and our data producers and the discovery vendors are all facing many more vocabularies that need to work well together. And there's right now no global crosswalking, no overarching guidelines about which vocabularies to use, no standards and best practices for selecting and applying the vocabularies if you're a data creator. So those were our problems right now. Right now, I learned there are some current NISO projects that relate to this. They have some policies supporting vocabulary use and reuse, or they're working on policies, I should say. Documentation and best practices for linked open vocabularies, LOV, and preservation of vocabularies as they either become abandoned or updated and so forth. So our thoughts were that for data creators, they need to know which vocabularies exist. They need standards and best practices to guide non-librarians creating and using those vocabularies. It needs to be something that is standard so it gets the attention that it needs or deserves from the bodies who might not just pay attention to the fact that librarians think that it's a good idea to use a standard vocabulary. And for discovery vendors and searchers, we need documents and best practices for making vocabularies work well together, and also maybe guidelines on what sort of administration and user tools should be in the systems so that we can manage those vocabularies. There was also some conversation about what role NISO might have for helping with crosswalks, and I threw out that maybe there needs to be some sort of way to vet the various hundreds of vocabularies that exist and make recommendations about what to use for which situations. And that's all I have. Is there anything I missed you guys want to add? Okay. Hope I didn't go over.
We don't have a timer. Does anybody have any comments, questions? But thank you. Before we move on to the next table, does anybody have any comments or questions or thoughts about the conversation that took place in table 1? So, here.
Who are the data creators that are at the table? What organizations are you?
Healthcare was the answer. Health systems. So, here.
Okay. It's a health system, and I'm the librarian, and I did drag one of my IT people with me because she understands controlled vocabularies, but I have a group back there that we have 20 variations of date and time right now, and that's the easy problem.
There are many standards for date and time. That's something we want to avoid because that's messy. All right. Any other questions, comments before we move on? Okay. So, table 3.
Yes. Okay. Our question was, what was it? Direct transfer of bib data to discovery instead of in the catalog. So one of the issues we clarified was the vendor saying, I've got to create XML data to feed into the discovery system, and I've got to create MARC data to create into the ILS. One of the decisions we made was we need to get rid of the OPAC. We get rid of the OPAC and our discovery tool becomes a discovery tool. We feed the information for discovery into that. Our traditional library system becomes a digital management system or a rights management or a, what was the word you used, Anne-Marie? An asset management system. That's where we track how much did we pay for this, what do we physically own in the building, when did we buy it, those types of things. And I think, I know there's one vendor here that's moving in that direction where they don't call it an ILS, they call it a library management system. So we decided that rather than create all these data forms, or we have our discovery tool that becomes the way that our users find things. We don't have the OPAC anymore. And that's going to be a challenge because somebody said, my subject librarians aren't going to let go of their OPAC. They love using those subject terms in the OPAC. And it's like, okay, we make the discovery tools robust. The discovery tool becomes exactly that, a way to discover the resources that you as a user have access to. We use the library system to become a way to manage what did we pay for it, what do we physically have in the building, when we do inventory for those types of things, because we don't inventory our e-journals. We don't have to inventory those. We have a different tool for that. We're moving away from rich OPACs. If Discovery can handle granular data for search and access. We want NISO to help establish standard to join up all the title level IDs and listing all ISBN, DOIs, product codes. We want NISO, and as somebody from one of the vendors pointed out, YBP pointed out, an example of 7 manifestations of one ISBN. And you have to excuse me, I'm a cataloger. When I think manifestations at work, expression, manifest, I have to change my thought process on that. Because I say, okay, we've got the same work in all these different formats, but it's actually the same thing. And the challenge becomes, how do we display that to our users? How do we make it findable? And how do we keep track of usage and what we have the rights to? So that was our goal, is that NISO somehow is going to wave their magic wand and help create some type of standard level title IDs. Questions? I had a library instructor who, when I was in library school many a year ago, who said, dream big. And I said, wouldn't it be great in a library if you could have these books that have little things on them that the shelves could read, and when you want a book, it would just pop the little book out on the shelf? Well, yeah, it's called RFID. But back 25 years ago, nobody ever heard of it, and then the library instructor said, that's a ridiculous idea, you don't get a good grade for the assignment. So the thing is, dream big, because if we don't dream big, then we can't achieve those big dreams.
So a standard title level ID is sort of the equivalent of FedEx, then.
Yes, that's your job. That's your job.
That's our job. Any questions or comments on that? Pretty simple and achievable, I would say. Okay, next up. Thank you. We're going to step out of order here.
Yeah, we'll go to group 8, 138. Interesting counting. Our topic was interoperability of non-text with discovery, specifically sound, image, research data. And the kind of founding or initiating questions were dealing with university archives, a bunch of images that have little to no metadata, music scores and recordings that aren't necessarily linked to each other, and how they might be made available in discovery tools, ETDs and other digitized content in an institutional repository, and research data sets. We talked a lot about, I think the biggest crux of the problem came down to the metadata needs to be cleaned up in some way, and before we can really think about ingesting it and making it available in the discovery systems. So I think the one concrete idea that came out of it was for some of the research data sets that may have some particular, like all of this has value, but the research data sets could become more critical in the coming years. Potentially working with other institutions and professional associations in specific subjects and genres may work together. So one example was, I think, astronomy data, some data sets. If there's a professional association and a group of libraries that have the same problem, it might be economically feasible to come up with a program that could get a consistent vocabulary and backlog that would address the backlog, some kind of workflow, perhaps even a grant from an appropriate organization. So it's kind of the foundational problem that has to be solved. How do you get some cleaned up data? There are tools that could be used. It's probably hard to imagine that any one library would be able to have the capacity to develop, to work with some of the scanning tools and some of the cleanup work that needs to happen, but maybe collaborating together, there would be a way to get that. Did I miss anything on that? So far, so good. We also we had two vendors present, Atlas Systems and Ex Libris, and one of the issues that came up, again, with metadata was some inconsistent metadata, incomplete metadata for finding aids and making special collections available. And I don't think we had any particular answer for that, did we? No, no. It's an ongoing problem, and no particular, and I'm sorry to say, no particular request from NISO to help us out. Let's see. One thing that may help out going forward is researcher IDs such as ORCID. And we thought that perhaps for some of the, one way to help address the backlog is to start building something going forward that would attract people who have some investment in the background to get in the backlog to get that, get their data sets addressed. So if having a researcher ID, assigning an ORCID makes content visible and better tools to make data sets more visible, other people, the people that own the original data sets that are part of the backlog might have some motivation to participate in a way to clean up, to help clean up data, the metadata, and make it more visible. And my particular thing that I'm interested in, we're actually, I realized through the discussion that at UCLA with the CDL, the partnerships that we have, we're in pretty good shape, and we've got a lot of images and sound and stuff that we want to make available, and we do have some pretty consistent metadata to work with that. So once I think anybody can reach that point, what I'm really hopeful is with resource sync as a possibility of making content available, and as it proves valuable, anybody who's interested in harvesting it will be able to and include it in their discovery systems. So we're experimenting with that with the Calisphere, taking the content from our digital library and making that available through resource sync to Calisphere, and eventually, and then it will get into the digital library program, DPLA. And so there's a good chance of making stuff discoverable through some standards that have already emerged from NISO, and I think it's a question of the motivation of the discovery tools and the vendors and whether there's value in adding that to their collections. Whether it requires a particular relationship with the content owner to initiate it, or if there's just value in these resources in making them available even though they're open source. So did that cover everything? That covered everything, yay.
How many of you are familiar with resource sync? Okay. For those of you who don't know, Resource Sync was a project that NISO undertook in partnership with the Open Archives initiatives. They're the folks who developed PMH, the protocol for metadata harvesting. We, NISO, approached actually the Discovery to Delivery Topic Committee, approached OAI to say there are problems with PMH since the protocol was developed in 2003, thereabouts. It's well over 10 years old. There are problems with it. could we try to fix them? Their response was, we can't believe people still use it. We should do something else. Because instead of simply transferring materials, metadata about resources, web-based resources, I think that battery might be failing, that people would want to exchange the actual resources themselves. So, quick swap. So we developed this specification with a grant from the Sloan Foundation. There's plenty of documentation on the NISO website, as well as videos from the development team, how to implement it, et cetera. There are even some open source repositories of some code you can use to implement it as well. So if you're not familiar with ResourceSync, go take a look. If you have any questions, let us know. We're also thinking about doing some, trying to get some funding to develop some more open source implementations of ResourceSync. We think it's a great specification, and we all should use it. Any questions apart from that? I thought that was an important little, if you don't know about it, public service announcement, there's a NISO standard for that. Does anybody have any other questions or comments, thoughts about table number 8? No? Thank you. So who wants to be next? All right. Go ahead.
Okay. Am I supposed to stand somewhere? Okay. All right. Hi. So table number 6 was a fairly big group, and we were talking about open access discovery. So there were several issues we did a round robin and went around the table and talked about what we all are interested in. It came down to trying to find a way to easily figure out exactly what an open access platform has in it and how open it actually is. There are many definitions of open, and open after 8 months isn't the same as open immediately. There's different things in different IRs, everything from theses and dissertations to student white papers to, other things that people may or may not want turned on in their discovery system. So that's kind of the path we went down to, is how do we help people managing knowledge bases and discovery systems to know what to turn on without spending oodles of time doing that. So we had some things we thought NISO could help with, some standardized metadata to allow OAMPMH to reveal OA status, some kind of place to determine OA publication quality, or a place to assemble criteria for judging quality. This is thinking mostly of IRs, some kind of complement to the DOAJ maybe. Was something published or was it just submitted? How do we get the discovery systems, the central index, to point to an IR? And do we know what we get when we do that? Talked about the discovery system versus the knowledge base. Do the discovery systems. We were all basically librarians of one stripe or another. We didn't have any vendors at our table. So we have a question, more for the vendors than NISO. Do the discovery systems have their own criteria for what gets into their central index as OA? Is it vetted at all? Yes. Cool. We just didn't have anyone to ask. So that's pretty much what we talked about.
I didn't hear who responded. Me. So are you answering for all of the discovery providers?
No, sorry, I was responding just my experience. Sorry, this is Letty from Sage. I was just responding from our experience. Not all of our OA titles are welcomed equally.
Okay, but I think to the specific. So to the specific question about quality vetting in terms of bringing content into a discovery service. for the 4 providers who are in the room? Do you want to answer that? A quick nod of the head, yes, no. Yes. Yes, yes. I mean, do you want to say anything more than yes? I mean, it's an open question. Do you want to say anything more than yes?
I hope so. So basic question, do we do any vetting of content as it relates to OA? Yes, we do, but I would suggest that it's not really different than the way we vet other content. And so we give it the benefit of the doubt, but we go through and understand, are these on any lists that we should be looking at? Do we actually have folks who research the content and understand, is it indexed in major indexes? And there's a variety of criteria that we look at our folks using this stuff. Where is it coming from? How does it work? What are the publishers actually doing? How does the process for peer review actually work? And can we dive into those things to make sure that we understand the content that we're going to provide an index? We believe very strongly in OA and try to do everything we can to pull it in. And so, but yes, there is a vetting process for sure.
Ida, do you want? Okay.
Just to add, because we're also indexing institutional repositories, and one of the criteria is to look at if they're really open access, because we get a lot of stuff which people claim is open access, but in fact they're not open access. So you need to just check if they're really accessible. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I'd say it's very.
Did you? No. Go ahead. Do you want to add something? No. Okay.
I think it's very similar. I mean, you're looking for things that are going to fit what your customers are looking for, and I think there's some basic criteria. For example, Beal's List, looking for something that's been well fitted by the community already. This is something that's in demand and useful.
Steve, do you want to add anything? Same answer from ProQuest. I think generally the answer is yes, and there is a. It's not a perfect, NISO standard for quality, but there are signals in the community regards to open access, like the DOAJ, et cetera. And I also would highlight NISO's Open Access License Indicators project. Access license indicators, not open access. We couldn't agree on open. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Next up.
Well, here I've got a microphone.
You got a mic? Okay. We'll jump. We'll do.
We looked at the increased visibility of library holdings in commercial search engines. Afterwards, I kind of broke this down into themes just to kind of bucket them up. So one of them was holdings knowledge, right? So when you look at this, it's a question of defining what the holdings are in the first place. It's a kind of a generic term. So it could be often when people think about this problem, they're thinking about books, and in particular public library books, but monographs versus articles versus databases, special collection. There's a number of different things that you're going to have to be looking at when you deal with this issue. Electronic versus physical. That's another one that often comes up. Are we including electronic holdings in this? And it could be, for example, ebook seems like an obvious one, but there may be many others. The articles one, once you go down that path, then you're really into a long tail of electronic. Open metadata, how do we enable actually sharing the metadata, and going along with that, the formatting and accessibility, the knowledge of the content. So that goes back into the BibFrame, the schema.org models, and how we're actually going to be sharing the data out. And then once you move down the path of actually assuming that all the data does exist and it's consumable by the search engines, you get into things like rights and permissions. So for example, identity of the person placed into at an individual level, placed into a physical location. Where are they? And that determines, in fact, what somebody might, on the search engine side, what might be shown. So which library would they have access to something from? And then once you would go down that path, and suddenly you're into kind of boundaries of libraries and who might have access to that library itself. So if it's a public library, you may be in a place where there may be 2 or 3, and you may have access to 1 or all. And then academic ends up being a particularly difficult one there, because location isn't necessarily tied into the rights themselves, what the libraries would confer. And then knowing rights and permissions, you know, statewide deals versus what a local library might have. So you could be, for example, in the state of Michigan, they might have bought a big package from one of the content providers, and everybody would get it, versus a local buy of some kind. And then kind of a miscellaneous bucket, there was some talk about policies of attribution. So once a user actually found something, you know, something like a watermark or watermarking brought to you by, so that the user actually would know that it was, especially if it was electronic content, that it was coming from the library itself. On the NISO opportunity side, there was have NISO facilitate conversation between libraries and search engine companies. We're having this conversation by ourselves as librarians and vendors, but search engines obviously play a big role here. Going back to the kind of the rights and permissions issue, community profile extensions, that is crosswalk what the library has access to where it might show up in a search engine, so the physical location. So mapping, being able to map those two together, there's some need there to be able to know where a person kind of fits into the library world. And then the role of NISO and identifiers. There are identifiers, and here are the relationships inside libraries and the environments we want to participate in some case about related to deduplication. I think this came up earlier in the case of you know, the ISBN and so on. So that same theme popped up on our side as well. That was it. Questions? Yes.
Here, let me.
Suddenly this MacBook Air seems really heavy when you actually hold it one-handed.
Okay. I just wondering about where the records for, what would you call it, the potential holdings of the library. So I'm thinking of the purchases on demand, that our catalog has a lot of things in it that we don't actually own.
Right.
And I'm just, and
Yeah,
that we
kinda,
take out and put in and so forth. And I'm
yeah,
just
that kind of
wondering
goes back
about
to that holdings definition, like what would you want to try and include?
Yeah.
It gets really complicated. It's a complex ecosystem when you get into licensed content versus physical holdings where you actually own something. Okay, thank you.
Another question? Are you, yes, no, no? Okay. Why don't we end this over here?
Hello? Okay, this is working. All right, so our topic was linked open data coexisting with vendor business models. And to frame that as a question, really we were asking, can linked open data coexist with vendor business models? And the short answer is no, but it wouldn't really be a service to us to just end it there. So we started off by defining linked open data, and the idea essentially was that linked open data is a very simple data model based around triples. And so this is subject, predicate, and object. And so the example given was title, author, and URL. And that you can do a wide variety of things with this data. A few of the things that we talked about was network analyses, doing a kind of a friend of a friend of a friend, the semantic relationship between those things, and really being able to tell, you know, do an author truth. So in being able to do, so the URI, thank you. So essentially being able to differentiate between John Smith's and the various authors. But fundamentally what we came down to was how do publishers have a business model if they're giving away their information for free? And so we talked a lot about that and then kind of moved past that because we kept hitting our head against the wall of, well, they can't have a business model. But some things that we thought about. So how do they have this business model if they're trying to give away their product? I mean, there's the obvious one of Facebook, which is that they could just rely on advertising money. There's the idea that we threw about, which is kind of partially linked open data. So you would give away linked open data for certain things, for some of your data, for some things that were less important and not nearly as instrumental to your business model. And another example given was the gold linked open data model, which is essentially that you could pay up front. Someone's going to have to pay for this in the end, so you could either pay on the front end or on the back end. An example given of someone who is doing linked open data that is a paid publisher is Getty. I don't know a whole lot about that, but it is actually happening out there. But fundamentally, the crux of the problem was that publishers want to monetize their product. And so if we're doing linked open data, and if we're talking truly open here, then we can't really get around that problem. And I think that's about it. Does anyone want to add anything else?
Any questions about that? No small challenge there for NISO.
No. One of the things we did think about was that NISO could act as kind of the intermediator between people wanting to use linked open data and vendors wanting to sell, rent, lease, provide access to linked open data. But of course, you know, once you're talking about selling, renting, leasing, you're not really talking about linked open data.
So NISO becomes OCLC.
Yes.
I think there is an organization organized to do that, but okay. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. Can it be combined with open access?
This feels like a naive question, but can it be combined with open access? Did you talk about the fact that that business model is different? You already have pay up front. You have a big content, so sort of proof of concept, effectiveness. I don't know how that would work, but did you talk about that?
Did we talk about open access at all?
Right, as an example of where the business model wasn't in the way, and you might be able to leverage or work in that space.
Yeah, we did. We talked about some of the different models that are out there that are funded in different ways. We talked about Archive, and we talked about Scope 3 and how... Yeah, so we absolutely did talk about that model as a potential different way to look at it.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of overlap between missions and approaches about distributing content freely, data freely, et cetera. So there are certainly overlaps there. Anyone, any other thoughts? Okay. Who's left? We'll do over here, and then you guys we'll wrap up over there.
Okay. Okay, so we were number 10, and the issue, it kind of goes along with number 8, and so a lot of us were debating which table that we should go to. And the issue was the discovery of unique library data in multiple formats and making that permanent. We discussed problematic resources, primarily non-text resources, ephemera, finding aids, anything that doesn't require item-level cataloging, streaming video, images, newsreels, university materials, lectures, visiting speakers, things that might have been put on video that the university owns and are trying to make it accessible. The issues we have are sometimes when using streaming collections in a discovery layer, you'll get all the metadata or none. And this presents users with materials that they sometimes cannot access. Also, it doesn't really divide it up into formats all the time, which can cause problems with things like interlibrary loan, where you have a user coming and finding a video and then realizing that it's streaming and they can't get it at their library because it's not available via interlibrary loan, which is an issue with the discovery services. We kind of feel like a lot of these others are trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. There's not really a standard for things like streaming yet. Libraries sometimes are deprecating collections because they can't be included into discovery services. And the other issue are these unique items, even if they are being described and are they at the bottom of the search results? Because maybe the metadata just isn't rich. Maybe there's not a lot of metadata. So how can we get our users to find it if it's just not the most rich metadata? How can we get something that's archival to show higher in a search result? I gotta scroll here. One moment. Okay, I'm back. So solutions, or what can we use for help? We talked about making systems interoperable, again, integrating protocols like OAI, PMH, Resource Inc. Best practices discussion, how can we deal with these archival materials? What can the discovery service providers help us with? How can we provide you with material that will make it easier for you, that will in turn make it easier for libraries to be able to turn these services on? What do the providers need? What should be left in the file? How can we prevent the loss of metadata when we are sending files that maybe this metadata isn't ingested as rich as we'd like it to be? We talked about internal things like outreach, letting students know that a library just isn't for books. When you're looking for something like a streaming video, they'll usually go to something like YouTube, so that could be done internally. And then we kind of felt that systems were biased toward textual content. So how can we make our content easier to work with? Because we're more than willing to do that. And just basically things like that. How do we deal with multimedia content? And any suggestions or discussions that could help us do that would be wonderful. So that's what we have.
Any thoughts or questions, comments? Okay, over here.
I guess what I'm wondering is, you made the comment that our non-print or non-textual items are not as accessible as the print ones. And is that because of their format, or just because they don't have as rich metadata? So if they had richer metadata, they would be higher in those discovery lists, they'd place higher, they'd be more accessible.
I don't think we really know. We didn't really come to a conclusion because we don't know. And in some cases, they really don't have a lot of metadata. And the initial thought is that's probably why they're not as high, but I don't know.
Well, sounds like a pilot study might be useful.
Yeah.
Lei?
Letty from Sage again. I can add a little something just from the provider side. I know anything that we produce that doesn't fit into the box of journal or book is very hard to get into the supply chain sort of stream. So one of the things we were talking about was ISBNs at this table, and I was explaining how we've sort of been slapping ISBNs on just about everything that isn't a journal.
We've also started doing that.
Yeah, because it's, when you're, especially when you're talking about Born Digital or even new digital wrappers for older content, there isn't a good model, and so I think the more that we can institute that in the supply chain, the easier it will be for everyone to contribute metadata and enrich that and make it easier to find. Because for the Born Digital stuff that we're publishing now, we are wrapping the heck out of it with data, and that makes all the difference. But the older stuff it's much harder to go back and rework it. So.
Yeah, I love having conversations with the ISBN folks about attaching ISBN numbers to just about anything that you could buy in a Barnes & Noble. Because in order to be in their product management system, it needs an ISBN number. So this is how you get ISBNs on plush toys. Any other comments or thoughts before we? All right, thank you. Yes. Oh, yes. Before we do our last table, before you all yes, there's one more table, but before we do that one last table, all of you who took notes, can you please send those notes either in virtual electronic form or analog form, physical form? And if you really want to keep the artifact, we can take a digital picture of it. Please send those to Nettie. That's NLAGACE niso.org. So a quick email would be greatly appreciated.
Could you say that one more time, please?
Sure. NLAGACE at niso.org. nlagace at niso.org. All right, our last table.
Thank you. Okay. So we, oh, sorry, Jeff. We were table 5, and we had metadata quality. And so the theme, I think, additionally to the metadata quality was really transparency. And I think we've heard a lot about that today with each table providing a little bit more of that information. So I think it's a good thing that we're ending with metadata quality here. A couple really big points of conversation that we were discussing is that, oh, and a very interesting I guess, fact is that most of the table was filled with librarians and also publishers. So I think we had a very good, healthy conversation that got us to some of our, I guess, requests towards the end. So what we found is that there are many different of the content providers that were not following a certain standard. Yes, we have KBART that we have been using, but it seems that there are different asks from some of the different discovery service vendors that we're trying to kind of funnel. And so that was one thing that we, as towards the latter part of this, that really is going to come out as an ask. We also are wondering, does location have an effect for easy proxies and other ways of accessibility? Is where that's located, is that affecting discoverability at all? So that was something that was a hot topic. As we look at the metadata, is there really a better and a correct way that we can be creating the metadata? I think overall, the main goal is that we want the content accessible. Librarians want to be able to provide the content to their patrons, and so how are we best creating that? Within the metadata itself, once it's given to the discovery service vendor, and as we look at how that's then almost created into a subject, there seems to be many different subjects. If we were to create, from the publisher side, if we were to create almost to enhance the metadata by some type of a thesaurus or taxonomy, would that be helpful? So that was a question that we wanted to put out there. Is that something that would maybe down the road be of want? So really in looking through that healthy conversation of where we want to go with recommendations for NISO, I think that NISO is the perfect facilitator for this discussion, and as Julie had mentioned from IEEE about bringing together everybody in this room to have that conversation of starting from this point on of how do we make things better and being transparent and what is going to be the best way to do so. I think that's really what NISO's role could look like. NISO, I don't know if you agree moving forward, if that is where you would like to be in that role, but I think that would provide again, further conversation with all players of librarians. You have your publishers and also the discovery service vendors coming together. Again, it's just that transparency moving forward. Anything? Questions? Comments? No?
And yes, this
okay.
that is a role for NISO. Any other comments or questions on that? Kind of nicely summarizes some of the themes that we've been coming up with. All right, so we have a few things that we can add to the list of what should NISO do. And again, please send the notes to Nettie so that we can get those down. We will add a few of the ideas that came out of this to that list, but if you would, at any time, add your own thoughts and ideas to Also, horizon issues. We have a few more spots for ideas for horizon issues. And if those of you on the live stream, you can also contribute your ideas. So that brings us to the end of day one. I think, woohoo. Okay. Well, almost to the end, because we do have a reception afterwards. So, first, I'd like to thank all of our speakers today who contributed to the conversation. As I said, we started out from a perspective of speaking more to you, and you all will do more speaking to each other tomorrow. As I said, we've got 2 more roundtable discussions. We've got some ideas, and we can share about where things might be headed. But we definitely want to bring your perspectives into this conversation. It's one of the main reasons we bring you all together. Again, I'd like to thank our generous sponsors for bringing us all together and keeping the costs low for this event. So many thanks to EBSCO, Ex Libris, ProQuest, Elsevier, and Atlas, as well as Sage. Sage has done, has kicked in to sponsor the reception, so big thanks to them for that. Tomorrow, we will begin, we'll have breakfast again at 8 to 9. The program will start promptly at 9. We will run through about 3:30, 4 o'clock tomorrow, 4 probably. We will tomorrow organize a couple sign-in sheets if anyone wants to share taxis or if they're headed to somewhere other than the airport. If you're headed to the airport, the light rail is probably the easiest way, but we'll certainly help anyone who needs suggestions. Also, we didn't plan for a group dinner, again, to keep costs down. If you need advice on where to get dinner, please grab anyone of the NISO staff. We all have our various favorite places if you haven't already arranged something. So with that, I want to thank, first of all of the people who've stuck in on the live stream. Many thanks to you all. We'll see you all tomorrow, or you'll see us. We won't see you. And then with that, we'll draw everything to a close. And we have, I think, about 30 minutes to relax before the reception starts. Again, that'll be out in the atrium area facing the patio, sort of that way. Room at the end of the hall that way. Again, we're scheduled to start at 6. So thank you all, and have a good evening.